Our next speaker is the Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the National Academy of Design. He just recently received his doctorate in the history of art from the Graduate Center of City University of New York. I'd like everybody to welcome Dr. Marshall Price.
Thanks, James. I thought I would sit at the table because it keeps me closer to the speakers tonight. I think in a way I almost have the hardest job here because instead of speaking about my work, I have to respond to what's just been spoken about. And I'd like to thank you, James, for bringing together such a diverse array of approaches and viewpoints tonight. I think James Cooper, you and I probably don't see eye to eye on contemporary art, but at least we share a love of the Hudson River School. Maybe you could be persuaded. You know, Wolf Kahn, who is perhaps one of, if not the most successful living landscape painters, gave a famous lecture, 5 Good Reasons Not to Be a Landscape Painter. And I think tonight we've probably seen at least 5 good reasons why landscape painting is not only important, but perhaps even critical in terms of larger issues in contemporary society. Kathy, when you gave the introduction, I thought you brought up a very good point with the similarity of dynamics between past and present that we can see today in a lot of landscape painting. Certainly, you know, John Moore juxtaposed against Thomas Cole isn't something that I would necessarily have thought of at first, but you certainly illuminated a number of really important points. Gregory, your presentation I thought was wonderful, and you and I were speaking a little bit earlier about the West and the Western landscape, and this is another thing that I thought, James, was wonderful, that you actually brought 2 landscape painters who are sort of known as Western, essentially Western landscape painters to New York City. I think there's a great divide between the Western landscape and the Eastern landscape in many ways, and there shouldn't be. But generally speaking, people on the East Coast don't know a whole lot about what's going on out West. And the landscape tradition out West is incredibly rich and deep, and while it may deal with slightly different issues than some of the landscape in the East, it certainly is relevant in a larger context. Linda, you mentioned something that made me think. All week I've been sort of racking my brain about trying to think of this continuous lineage to landscape painting and how it's been, whether or not it's been continuously relevant since the Hudson River School. And, you know, I worked my way all the way up until about the 1940s, and then I got stuck. And I was trying to think of how landscape was relevant beginning in the 1940s. And something you said, and I didn't write it down, but something you said made me think about this. And I realized that a lot of the abstract painters in the 1940s and just after really are they're intricately linked to the landscape tradition in this country. I mean, if we think of painters like Clifford Still, Jackson Pollock certainly, you know, they actually came from the West, and that landscape, that Western landscape, that landscape sensibility was ingrained into their minds as they matured. Sarah, I was really interested that you mentioned how landscape has been linked to privilege and property, and I think that's an important point that we should remember, is that, you know, there are power dynamics going on in a lot of landscape painting, and especially, well, not only contemporary landscape, but also landscape of the past. And Hudson River School landscape, especially sort of second and third generation, I think there's an interesting shift in the dynamic between artist landscape, viewer landscape that happens. You also mentioned, Sarah, regional or local concerns, and I think that's one of the things that I thought was interesting when you were speaking about that is that, you know, while it's true oftentimes painters, landscape painters are associated with a region or a locale, and oftentimes they are dealing with local or regional concerns, almost always those concerns can be extrapolated into a more universal context and have an important message about the larger context, whether it be environmental issues or what have you. I guess I'll just conclude by saying that while we really only looked at landscape painting, I think that artists of my generation and even younger are engaging with the landscape in ways that are really sort of critical in the way that they're illuminating a lot of the same issues that were brought up tonight. And they are not necessarily painters. They work in performance, they work in video, they work in photography. And just to name a few that came into my head earlier today, and these are all artists who you can see in New York City. In fact, one was just written about in the New York Times a couple weeks ago. Her name is Marie Lawrence, and she has this Tide and Current taxi. I don't know if any of you have heard about that, but you can actually hire her to take you around the waterways of New York in a homemade boat. And, you know, she's very much engaged with the landscape. And while she's not a painter, she's a landscape artist, and she's performing within the landscape, engaged with the landscape, and very concerned about the issues that are facing the landscape. There are many others. Mary Mattingly is another one who has a similar type of approach. There are painters, Carla Wozniak, Julian Kramer, Maureen Galas, Adam Savanovich, Alexis Rockman is very well known. And also a photographer who I think is making a great impact, J. Henry Fair, who does a whole series that he calls Industrial Scars, which are these very beautiful photographs of industrial disasters within the landscape. So I want to thank you all, because I think it was illuminating to hear you all speak and to really articulate the ongoing relevancy of landscape painting and landscape art. Thank you.
We hope we have succeeded in presenting diverse points of view, representing a variety of artists and scholars who all care about really the same things. Earlier, when you arrived, you saw on your chairs index cards. If there are any questions, are there any questions? Did anybody happen to write down a few? There are a couple here in the back. Before we begin the reception, I'd like the audience to be able to pose a few questions, one or two, okay? The question comes from, it doesn't say, well, it's addressed to James Howard Kunstler and Dr. Price. The question is, landscape painting seems more marginalized than ever in the blue chip gallery world, yet ecology, sustainability, etc. is more prominent than ever. So how would you address the lack of connection?
Well, I had an interesting experience shopping for a house about 15 years ago. I was married to a wealthy woman, and we went to look at very expensive houses. And these were houses owned by orthopedic surgeons, tax attorneys, all kinds of people like that. And they didn't have a goddamn thing on their walls. Nothing. Maybe, this was even before the era of this flat screen TV. Maybe they had an airbrushed, photograph of their kid from school. And maybe they had some kind of, craft construction of copper sailboat things that they picked up in Nantucket, But they had no interest in what we think of as the traditional depiction of the world in paint. But what's happened, of course, I think that what's happened in the university is actually quite a bit more disastrous, because the art world followed in the footsteps of the humanities and flew up its own butthole with critical theory. And we're still lost there. We're in the wilderness of critical theory, and we never left. And until we decide to leave, until serious people decide to leave that wilderness, then probably the public itself is going to continue to be befuddled and misled, and they won't have any art. They won't buy it either.
You're a hard act to follow. I think, in a general sense, painting itself has been marginalized in some of the blue chip galleries. I think there's been a bit of a return to painting in some of the blue chip spaces, but why that is, I can't really tell you in a 30-second or 15-second soundbite, but I think it should be recognized that the landscape is actually still very much alive. In fact, there's an exhibition at Gallery Lalong right now, which is called The Altered Landscape, and it's a group show with Joan Jonas and Andy Goldsworthy and a number of other fairly influential artists. And I think, I just went to go see it on Saturday, and it sort of reminded me that, oh yeah, the landscape actually is still sort of in the discourse, even though it might not be in the discourse in terms of painting, but it still is out there and very much alive and relevant.
Jim.
Art doesn't exist within a vacuum. And the Hudson River School is a perfect example of that. They were very tied into their communities. When you talk about where is art today? Well, where is America today? I'm getting into my jihad. You see a sense of crumbling of values and standards. And as Aristotle pointed out, and several other philosophers, arts set the standard. Even if it's created in the past, it sets us a high standard when your society, when your civilization is in trouble, to remind you what is excellence, what is sacred, what is true. And that's what we've lost. And art is trivialized, and everything else is trivialized. Motion pictures, music, television, pop culture used to be the last resort of some kind of taste back in the 30s. But we've lost that too. So you can't just take art for itself. It involves the entire civilization. And if there is a problem with art, it's like the nightingale in the cave. There's something amiss in society today. And I think this trauma we're going through, it was already anticipated in the arts.
Well, I guess, if I can leap in, the question about the art market seems to be appropriate because it is a bit confusing. I think you look at American landscape painting for the last 150, 200 years, and there is a distinct kind of conversation about nature and art as being sort of a nexus where science and spirituality and military activity and industry and in fact, the society as a whole intersect. I mean, one could take the definition of landscape by the late J.B. Jackson as being something that is not created by nature, but by people when they organize terrain into realms of human activity and value. I think most people have a look at landscape as just simply terrain, as an inert medium that's a passive tool in the hands of an artist. And I think also it's confusing when one tries to divide the discussion about meaning from the antics of a market that's trying to turn artwork into instruments of high finance. And so, you know, how does one understand this? And I think for an art student, or for a person who's not perhaps professionally engaged in the world of art, it's very confusing. And I think in a lot of ways it's confusing for we who are. So anyone on the panel care to address that?
I'm glad you brought up J.B. Jackson. He's someone that really influenced me, and one of his books was called The Necessity for Ruins, and his point was that this period of ruination happens in shorter and shorter cycles, and so you have this death, the rebirth, and then a golden period. And we're always nostalgic for the last golden period. And the fact is, it's a continuation, and change is what is constant. And so the most creative period, and I think this is true, and what led me to paint a lot of modern ruins, is when things are fallow. So that's when you can really learn. That's when you can start to create something. It's a beginning. And in response to the why not blue chip galleries, I think maybe the question to ask is, how are we sustaining the people that are doing landscape, that are, or the 20-somethings, the 30-year-olds who are finding new ways to paint about the environment now? How do we find them, and how do we sustain them? I think it's possible to find people with the new technologies that are there. I think there's some real good in being able to look around the country and source galleries in Portland or Seattle or LA and really say, oh, I really believe in what that person is doing, and buy something.
I think a couple of other comments were interesting, like Jim Cooper observing that 150 years ago this audience would have leaders of the community with us here this evening, and also at that time those artists, especially artists who were attaching themselves to expeditions with people like F.V. Hayden and others into the American West, were very influential in shaping the vision of American terrain and actually giving the nation a self-image that identified itself with certain places on the surface of the earth. And I don't really see a lot of artists today who have that same agency, who are engaged at that, on that same level. The idea that an artist like Kensett was actually on a committee advising the renovation of the U.S. Capitol building in the 1850s. That kind of engagement, I mean, the artistic dialogue has become perhaps a bit too cloistered. Is that possible? Who's whistling? Who would like to address that engagement? So, Sarah.
Well, actually,
that was aimed at you, actually, that whole preamble. Yep.
Sorry.
It was a setup.
It was a setup?
Yep.
Could you repeat the question? No. No. What was your feed line? Come on, stop it. I was just thinking about, I feel that artists tend to be very elitist and think that the world is going to come to their door. And I really believe in getting out there and paying attention to what is around you, and thinking what your responsibility is as a citizen. And I don't mean that like in, I don't know, I think it's very important to take part in a dialogue, whether you're a painter or whatever it is. You need to have your voice there, because as artists, we're creators of culture. I don't think we believe that anymore about ourselves, but I think it's really true. And if we're passionate about something and we want people's minds to be changed about something, that's what art can do. Art can change people's minds.
Kathy?
I just wanted to bring the historical perspective to this for a second, because if you think of the heyday of the Hudson River School, and we're thinking that this is a moment when, you know, Frederick Church could build his Olana based on his profits, it was a period when there really were no commercial art galleries. And the artists had lived in the 10th Street Studio Building and lived in some of the other buildings in New York in a kind of sense of having a community space where they would show their work. They would advertise, you know, one Saturday a month is the Dodworth building is open. Everybody came to the openings. And there was a lot of emphasis on the fact that the artist's responsibility was to interface with the public. Or in Jim Cooper's discussion, you know, Cole put his picture in his shop window, but that was, you know, a bookstore or something. It wasn't a gallery. So the whole idea of how the artist can interact with the public and intersect with the public, I think that, you know, that's another issue that we might come away with. And, you know, things like the internet now, of course, are playing a different role, and people have Facebook pages and blogs. So it's, again, another whole opportunity to, you know, get your particular point of view out there and not be so dependent on the so-called blue chip people or, you know, or other kinds of institutions, because they weren't always in place in this period that we're somehow holding up as a moment when landscape painters were relevant and, you know, people owned art.
Greg?
There's a screaming need for artists to realign themselves with scientists, and around the edges, it's happening. I don't know if it will be powerful enough. I was just reading about the head of exhibitions at the American Museum of Natural History, Stephen Quinn, got a scholarship to return to the Congo to do a new painting of what the gorilla diorama landscape looks like today. There's an abundance of opportunities to work at the edges, to work with scientists. There's scholarships to Antarctica. Janet Morgan and I have worked in a number of national parks. There's other venues besides the gallery world, and I think in a lot of ways we need to look beyond that. We're in a moment where there's just an incredible abundance of images, and I think one of the things artists have to do is make intelligent selection, informed selection, and show people what's really important out there.
Are there any other comments from the panel? Would anybody care to add anything more? I'd like to thank everybody for their time and their inspiring presentations. Thank you for coming, and please enjoy the reception at the back of the gallery. Thanks.